So our next speaker is Jaye Starr. Jaye Starr is an aspiring Muslim hospital chaplain, community organizer, artist, and activist in Michigan. She is a graduate of Hartford Seminary's Islamic Chaplaincy Program and has also studied with Al Amana Center in Oman, the Indonesian Consortium of Religious Studies at Universitas Gadjah Mada, the Center for Islam and Medicine, and the Fellowship at Auschwitz for the study of professional ethics. Currently, Jaye acts as a community liaison on a hospital ethics committee, serves her local masjid, and also organizes community resiliency workshops. Jaye is interested in supporting the development of the field of Islamic chaplaincy and is particularly interested in Islamic bioethics, pre- and post-natal care, and improving the dying experience. Please join me in welcoming Jaye Starr to the podium.
Just keep going. Well, okay, great.
We'll make it happen. Don't hold back.
I greet you with Assalamu alaikum, which Baron talked a little bit about earlier. It is a greeting that is given from Muslims, but also Arab Christians use the term as well. And it is a greeting that you may know the peace in your heart of being connected with God. I'm going to talk today about the presence of Islam and Muslims in America, and then we are going to look at Islamophobia, and I'm specifically looking at in the ways that it impacts your students, because I know many of you have indicated an interest in being able to better support your students. And then we're going to talk some more about the sort of the nitty-gritty logistics of having Muslims in the classrooms and some ways that you can navigate that. This sort of came up a little bit earlier, but to give you a sense of the diversity of the American Muslim population, we don't actually know how many Muslims are in the United States, and that's because of the separation of church and state the way we practice it here. It's not in the purview of the government to be asking that. We estimate we're somewhere between 1% and 2% of the population. The graph that you see here is a little bit misleading because Caucasian is used as a very large category here to include Arab Americans, among others, mixed in. Sorry, I don't have this, but I think you saw it earlier, that there still continues to be a very large immigrant population. And I don't remember the number, but I know you've got that in your packet. So when we look at how Muslims have come to be in the United States, the earliest presence of Muslims came through the transatlantic slave trade. There are varying estimates, but when we look geographically at where in Africa people were being brought from, there's estimates up to 1/3 of the enslaved Africans who came were Muslim. What we know is that when they got here, their practice and relationship with Islam changed. And it changed from person to person and community to community. Some people maintained a practice of Islam. Some people maintained a private practice of Islam while outwardly practicing Christianity. We talked about how religion and politics are connected, and certainly that was true in a plantation setting as well, very much so. We know that some people departed from Islam altogether and embraced Christianity, and we know that others had blended practices. It's exciting as sort of people go back and scholars now understand more about Islam, the way in which they can see some Islamic practices showing up in early practices by enslaved people that weren't necessarily recognized as such previously because the scholars didn't have that knowledge base to be drawing from. Any art teachers in this crew? One, all right, excellent. Art has so many beautiful ways to connect with Islam and Muslims. But this particular image here is of a man who was brought from Africa as an enslaved person and who continued to keep a practice of Islam and was known for his piety and for being very devout. He was enslaved, I believe, for 45 years before gaining his freedom. This is a part of a collection of paintings that's at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where you can learn more about him and his family. When he died, he was buried in the graveyard of the corner where he was known to go. And I'm sorry, he was buried in the garden in the corner where he was known to have gone and performed his prayers. One other story that I'll share from this is once there was a very learned man who had come from Africa and who was literate in the Islamic sciences, and was asked to write the Lord's Prayer in Arabic. And what he did was to write Al-Fatiha, which is the opening verse of the Quran. It is the prayer that Muslims pray 17 times a day, and it is the sort of go-to verse, if you will. So he wrote that in Arabic. And some people have questioned, well, was he trying to be deceptive? Did he not realize that there was a difference? Or was it that he saw the similarity? And I think in many ways it was that seeing the similarity between things, that what was in the Lord's Prayer for him resonated so strongly with what was in Al-Fatiha as well, that seeing that connection between things. But it speaks to the way in which we see a conversation going on between Christianity and Islam in the lived practices and realities of people who were here. We also know that as time passed, many of these people stopped practicing Islam. So we don't necessarily have a continuous narration of Islam between all of the generations of people who are here. Which brings us to the sort of next wave, if you will, of Muslims coming to the United States. And this begins sort of between 1890s to the 1920s. It was mostly Arabs and actually mostly Christians. But the Christians and the Muslims generally settled together. They ate the same Arab food, they read Arabic language newspapers, they had a cultural connection that transcended their religious practices. In fact, the area around where the World Trade Centers used to be known as Little Syria because it had such a large population coming from Syria, that predominantly Christian. I grew up in upstate New York, north of a city called Utica, which has a similarly old Lebanese population there in that area. One of the things that I love in this picture, I hope you can see it. So this is an early 1950s religious education class in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And it looks so quintessentially American. You see you've got the students together, men and women. The women are wearing long dresses, but nobody has headscarves on, and they're reciting that opening prayer that I just spoke of Fatiha. Today, this mosque continues. It's I believe, the oldest continuing mosque in America, though there are debates about that, but it is certainly one of them. And this is my friend Dima's congregation. So Dima is the Syrian immigrant. She is the president of her mosque in Cedar Rapids. It's actually not hers. She takes them over to visit the other mosque every year. And so you see the continuity, but also the changes. And let me actually specifically speak about Dearborn. I know that was a question that came up earlier. So Dearborn is another community that had a large Arab population with Christians and Muslims settling together. One of the things that I love about Dearborn is that the continued presence of Christians and Muslims, both Sunni and Shia, together in their similarity and in their differences. My understanding is that the big boom in Dearborn came in 1927 when Ford opened a new factory there. There's also something to be said for people choosing to you could say come together, but you could also say isolate themselves to some extent from the larger community. One of the things that's unique about Dearborn, which is different from a lot of the communities such as the one where I live or Little Syria in New York City, is that it has had a continuous connection to immigration coming from the Levant region, so Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, et cetera, in that area. One of the things that is unique in that way is that language has been maintained. So the Lebanese population where I live doesn't speak Arabic anymore. They cook Middle Eastern foods for holidays, but it's a sort of cultural tradition, not a lived cultural tradition in the same way. But in Dearborn, it's really maintained that sense of connection. The population has also, in addition to, maintaining the language, they've also maintained a sense of connection and tie to. So the way in which people are continuing to follow events and news and return home to practice, to connect with family, home being another country, it maintains a greater flow between the Middle East and here than a lot of the communities have. So it's unique in that regard. The other area where we have many American Muslims is through an African-American, I would say, re-embrace of Islam, or reversion, as is used in some communities of term, where we'd had this earlier practice of Islam, and then in the 1920s and in the decades that follow, there are a number of pseudo-Islamic practices that begin to pop up. The Nation of Islam is one of the best known. There's also the Moorish Science Temple. There were probably several dozen of these different pseudo-Islamic approaches to practice. And there were also some communities that from the beginning had a traditional Sunni approach to practice, though the Nation is sort of the biggest and the one that we know the most about. The Nation of Islam under W.D. Muhammad, who is this man here, actually transitioned into a Sunni practice of Islam. So the overwhelming majority of people who came into Islam through the Nation now practice a Sunni, we'd say Orthodox because it's sort of the majority practice of Islam. Another famous one is Muhammad Ali. Many of these families have now been generation for Muslims. This is my dear little friend Baby Q here, who's third generation. There's a common misperception that all African Americans are converts to Islam, and something students will oftentimes be asked is like, when did you convert to Islam? But now we have generations of that existing. And the Nation of Islam continues. Most Muslims would look at it and say it's un-Islamic, particularly around teachings regarding to race, where it is presented as the religion for black people, whereas Christianity is the religion for white people. We see in the Quran the teaching that God has made us in different colors and speaking different languages so that we might come to know one another. A turning point for W.D. Muhammad here was going on Hajj, and also for Malcolm X. Many of you may have read his autobiography. Going on the pilgrimage and seeing that there were Muslims from all over the world praying together with all different tones. Post-1965, the civil rights movement, the African American civil rights movement here, inspired legislative changes that allowed for highly skilled immigrants to come to this country in larger numbers than they had come previously. So particularly doctors, engineers, et cetera. And many of those people initially came thinking they may spend some time here and then return back home. And this has over time become their homeland. And now we see second and third generation immigrants from this population. So this is a group of my friends here, and you see the Americanness of them, because one of the things that happens anytime as people immigrate from another land is there is a blending of cultures and of traditions. I think one of the things that we'll talk a little bit about when we talk about Islamophobia is our tendency to see Muslims first and foremost as Muslims and as nothing else, in a way that we don't typically do with Christians, right? So people will ask me, well, what's Muslim clothing? Or what's Muslim food? Or are you from Islam? Meaning like from a country of Islam, thinking of us very kind of monolithically. And one of the things that we really want to drive home today in this presentation is that Muslims have a tremendous amount of diversity. But one of the things I would also bring to your attention is that Christians have that same diversity. Jews have that same diversity. Other faith groups have that same diversity. So when we think of something as being, for example, like this, as being Muslim attire, in fact, if I were to show you a picture of a Yemeni Jew, you would probably see a woman wearing a black full face veil that looks very quote unquote Muslim, right? Or we know that there are, when we look at Pakistani Christians, their dress is very similar to Pakistani Muslims, right? The food that they're eating is the same, has more to do with the culture that they're coming from. There's one universal Muslim food. Does any of the non-Muslims in the audience know what it is? Dates, yes. So the tradition, as you saw in the video earlier, when the time comes to break fast, we break fast with 3 dates is the tradition followed by the Muslim community around the world, and a sip of water. Though we have different preferences in dates too. A lot of American Muslims prefer the ones from California, but some prefer the ones imported from Saudi. There's a whole world of date culture as well, if you will. I also just want to pause on this for a moment to say, part of the impact of having this immigration system that has allowed for these highly skilled workers to come and then subsequently staying and having children, Muslim women are actually the second most highly educated group in America. So that's after Jewish women. So if you've ever visited a group of Jewish women, I suspect you haven't hesitated to ask them what they do or what they studied or where they went to college. And yet people are routinely anxious about asking Muslim women that. And yet, particularly here in a place like Ann Arbor, you're probably standing around a bunch of women who have PhDs in molecular biology and electrical engineering. Muslim women and Muslim men at large too, but there tends to be a very high level of education in the immigrant origin community, and specifically here in the Southeast Michigan realm of things. And that there was a joke earlier about the career choices. So universally for Muslims, we joke that there's 5 career choices. You can be a doctor, an engineer, a doctor, an engineer, or a doctor. Which can put a lot of pressure on your students. So you're talking about supporting your students. If you have a student who wants to become an artist, they may need a little bit of TLC. The other way that American Muslims have come to exist here is specifically through refugee resettlement, which I distinguish from immigration. Refugees don't have an option of going back home for fear of persecution. There are a number of different refugee resettlement communities. Some that are large are Bosnia, Somalia, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. These pictures are from my hometown, Utica, New York, which is about 25% refugee resettlement and descendants of the refugee resettlement program. They have saved, literally, the city of Utica from falling. We had a population decline from 120,000 down to 60,000. Refugees have been critical to maintaining the city and to restoring buildings. And one of those buildings here is a beautiful old Episcopalian church, which the city was trying to figure out how to financially, they were going to manage tearing it down. And a group of Muslims walked in and said, we'd really like to build a mosque to the mayor's office. Is there a place where we could do that? And he said, I have this building. Could we sell it to you for $1? And that's what they did. And the Bosnian community has beautifully restored it. Every Thanksgiving, they hold a Thanksgiving dinner and invite the former congregants to come together for a meal there. It's been a beautiful feature in the city. One of the things that I have particularly appreciated about the population is their commitment to service in America, to volunteerism and to civic engagement being very strong. This is my friend Haneen here, she's a double refugee. Her family is Palestinian. They ended up in Iraq, and then during the Iraq War, they ended up becoming refugees again here to the United States. She recently became a citizen. It's the first time she's been the citizen of any country. She served throughout high school in the ROTC program, and she just became a dental hygienist. The other student there is from Burma as well. Another way that we have a growing American Muslim population is through conversion. So oftentimes, again, when we think about conversion, we're thinking about African Americans, but this transcends all ethnic groups. We have a growing Latino population conversion, Asian American, a whole variety of different things. So these happen to be 3 of my friends here. And estimates are hard. As Brian said earlier, how many come in, how many go out, what does that look like? We don't have a lot of information about that. So I want to shift now into talking about Islamophobia. Before I do that, though, pause. Questions about American Muslim history or presence? Yeah.
You had said about the Nation of Islam in Chicago, you had called the Nation of Islam pseudo-Islamic.
Yeah, sure.
Can you go into that just a little bit more?
Absolutely, yeah. So we have it in the time that the nation comes into being. There are a number of movements that have, I would say, Islamic, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm sorry, I have a kid at home who's teething right now, and I'm a little sleep deprived. They're drawing inspiration from the imagined Islam. So what they think of Islam as being. So for example, in the Moorish Sides Temple, you said people wear red fezzes, right? Those aren't really Islamic, they're a Turkish thing, but they become an integral part of things. What people's understanding of the Quran is, what their understanding of various different Islamic practices or Muslim practices or perceived as, inspire a movement that speaks to the hearts of the people that they're working with, and that provides a new way of life and a new worldview of understanding things. But how much of it is actually rooted in Islam varies, right? So one of the things I mentioned particularly with the Nation of Islam, but also with the Moorish Science Temple and some of the other groups, is the distinguishing of this as being a religion for Black people, Christianity being a religion for white people, becomes a part of the story that's in it. Or this idea of reversion, we're going back to the religion of our ancestors. And I'll hear white converts use that term too when they talk about the idea that we are born in submission to Islam, and so they'll use the term revert, and that plays in as well. But there can be a difference in how that term is sort of understood. So like Muslims look at the Nation of Islam and they'll be like, that's not Islamic. They're not Muslims. They're not. But I think that there's something to be said for the nation trying to understand how Islam fit into their context. And again, in a day without the internet, right? It's pretty amazing. I have friends who are in one of the earliest Sunni movements, and they talk about how they had the Quran, and then they had this other book, a collection of the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And from that, they were trying to figure out what it means to live your religion, right? So they were going back to these two source materials and sort of saying, what does this look like here, and how do we do this? And now you can go on the internet and you can find so much, but they were waiting for correspondences to come back from scholars that would tell them how to do things, and really that engaged part of things. Yeah. Other questions? All right. So I want to talk about Islamophobia. And first, just I think it's helpful if we're on the same page in terms of definition. So this is from a British report that was done, and it defines it as an outlook or worldview involving unfounded dread and dislike of Muslims, which results in practices of exclusion and discrimination. How many of you are familiar, I know I've got a couple of American history teachers here, with the anti-Catholic discrimination in the earlier years of this country? Okay, a few, right? So for those of you who don't know, there was a tremendous amount of anti-Catholic discrimination. There was concern, part of the development of the US education system was a concern about how do we sort of Americanize people? What does it mean to be American? What's the connection with Protestantism that comes from that? There was a concern that people would have greater allegiance to the Pope than they would to the American system or to canon law as opposed to constitutional law. Almost all of that you can slip in Islamic terms and you'll find a similar thread into Islamophobia today. So there's a concern that we will have greater allegiance to the Ayatollah, which is funny because it's a Shia thing and not a Sunni thing, that we will have greater adherence to Sharia, and that can't coexist alongside of American law without really knowing much about what Sharia is. So a huge portion of Sharia is how we go about our daily practices. How do we pray? When do we pray? Where do we pray? What goes into our marriage contract? What goes into our will? All of those things, for us, we turn to the Sharia. How do we wash before prayer? All of these things are really integral to our daily lived experience. Yeah? Yeah, so and there was a question earlier that came on that, and so I think
sorry.
no, it's good because we didn't answer it. So I'm glad you're bringing it back. Most Muslim countries actually have constitutions that were largely taken from European countries. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's the Turkish one that is just a translation of the French one, and then slight adaptations. So one of the things that's really interesting is as colonization and pseudo-colonization come into Muslim majority contexts, one of the things that they tried to do was to codify Sharia so that they could enforce their interpretation of it. So for example, we see in Southeast Asia, it had been the scholars were intersecting with it in Arabic. And one of the things to do was to take it out of Arabic so that the colonizers had access to it as well. There's a beautiful writing of great frustration that there are these laws within Sharia, but they're not following them. Everybody just gets off the hook, basically. Off the hook wasn't the term that they were using, but this idea that there were these rules, but that they weren't being adhered to, and it would be easier for colonizing forces if they would follow them. And so by codifying them and taking it out of the tradition of scholarship, they could do that. One of the reasons things weren't being followed is because of the emphasis on mercy and on certainty. And so there's a saying that it is better to let somebody go if there's just a tiny little bit of doubt than to possibly punish the wrong person. There's also, much of the Sharia, as we talked about earlier, is this path. It can also be said as like the path to the watering hole. Sharia is about how do we come into relationship with God and God's creation. And a part of the Sharia is so that one can come, almost all, again, really all of it is how can we come closer to God? And so giving people opportunities to navigate that relationship with God is an integral part of a Sharia court. Countries, specifically to your question, countries that draw from Sharia as their primary and only source, fellow Islamic studies Muslims in the room, help me, I think only Iran? Saudi Arabia, though, they have another constitutional system. Sharia isn't the sort of be-all, end-all. They have a Sharia council, 20% of which is positions are now held by women, which is, well, before this last election, is actually more than we have female congressional representation, though I think that changed with the last election. And numbers you see similar in Iraq and Afghanistan post-war, where women actually play a larger percentage of things. So Sharia is a part, but it is not the whole. There are systems coexisting together. Yeah, sure. So how many of you have heard of Wahhabism? Yeah, a few. Okay, so I don't want to get too deep because we're going into like the Islam 202 presentation here, and I want to make sure we get through the 101 first. But Wahhabism is a specific approach to practice, which has largely connected within the history of Saudi Arabia, and between power of a teacher of Wahhabism and the sort of founder of it, and the Saudi the Saudi royalty family. They've got a marriage of convenience, if you will, in terms of how Saudi approaches their governance. If you want to go further than that, you're probably going to need to bring in a Middle Eastern political professor, because that's running out of my direct realm of things. But certainly that is a primary school of influence in terms of how people approach things, which is a little bit different from Salafism, because Wahhabis still fall a little bit more within a traditional Sunni framework of jurisprudence, whereas in the Salafi movement, there's been an attempt to go directly back to how the companions of the Prophet lived. Again, like this is like 202, 303 level stuff, so don't let it get bogging you down too much. Thanks. Are we good to move forward with Islamophobia? Yeah. Okay. So I want to ask all of you to go ahead and freeform brainstorm out loud. What are some of the ways that Islamophobia manifests itself? Hate speech. And can you give some examples of what type of hate speech? Okay. Stereotypes. And can we get some specific examples of stereotypes? Muslim women never work. Yes. And can I actually get somebody to write down up here? Yeah.
Laws that are supposedly equally affecting people of all religions, but actually mostly target Muslims, such as know the obvious signs of religion, which are obviously meant to target people who are.
All right. So we particularly see this in places like Quebec and in France. Yep. Yeah, neat.
My friend yesterday said, and I corrected him, I don't know if I corrected him correctly, but he said that Muslims want to convert America by having more children.
Ah, yes. The infamous right, we're that kind of idea that we're like a stealth movement and we're just going to have lots of kids and take over. Yeah, it's a really real one. A lot of people are really scared about that.
Just supposedly laws that supposedly affect people equally, but that are obviously targeting Muslims, such as banning religious bigotry, but that means aesthetics.
Yeah.
So I was like,
Everybody hear about the burkini protests that are going on right now in France? For those of you who haven't, there's a group of Muslim women who have taken to the pools wearing burkinis because it's illegal in France. It's illegal in France because the French government feels they need to protect Muslim women, as opposed to dealing with the thugs who are on the French beaches. But they specifically cite Rosa Parks. So for those of you who are thinking about teaching civil rights and how that movement here has continued to inspire movements around the world, that's a contemporary thing. As a side note, about 40% of the women who wear burkinis in France are actually not Muslim. They are largely skin cancer survivors. Other ways that we see Islamophobia. And can you say a little bit about what that depiction looks like? Sure. Yeah. Or the good Muslim who then gets killed by the terrorists. That's another favorite one.
We have to create an enemy to keep the war economy going.
Yeah.
Fundamental.
Big. Yeah.
My 3-year-old saw a picture of Malala, and she said, does she speak English? So even my 3-year-old looks at somebody with a headscarf and wonders if that person speaks the same language as her.
Right. One of my favorite ways that manifests is when people come up to me and say, "Do you need help?" Right, because actually I'm not deaf, though I appreciate the consideration that anyone you may be hard of hearing. But yeah, this idea that Islam is inherently other, inherently foreign. It can't be, people couldn't be American and be Muslim, or their if they grew up here, their families must have come from someplace else. Yeah.
Religion of Islam is portrayed mostly as religion of fighting, of war.
Spread by the sword. Yeah.
How about like labeling? I need to say, that Muslim woman instead of just saying that woman. Like labeling when it's unnecessary.
Right, because in our perception, it has an implication for the statement that follows. Yeah.
thing that I hear in Christian circles too is that it's sort of a made-up religion because Jesus was the answer and at the end. This evolving idea that there was this prophet, but it just doesn't make sense in a lot of Christian contexts.
Allah is something other, right? So Allah is not the same God of Christians, but something other. Yeah, and it's just because I want to make sure that's a relevant point to come back to, is that Allah is actually not a Muslim-specific term. So that's a term that's also used by Arabic-speaking Christians. And in a place like Indonesia, where the language of Arabic has had a big influence, it's also used by Indonesian Christians. But it's also understood as by Muslims as being the same God of the Christians and of the Jews. Yeah, you were going to say something earlier.
And then shades of that difference also come in, and then the clustering of men in one spot talking to women in another spot. It's not that it doesn't happen in America anyway.
Right.
But it seems to be personified by the group based on the attire and what happens. And that's commonly mentioned in schools.
Yeah. One of my favorite euphemisms is when we say traditional for Muslim women's attire. So my shirt's from Target. Is very much, I think it's a couple years ago because I got it on sale at the PTO thrift shop, but we have this sort of idea, or when we talk about, for example, some of the exquisite dress of like Nigerian women, it's not traditional, it's a very 21st century fashion interpretation of things. Does it draw from tradition? Yes, but is a woman who is inherently wearing, and I would go so far as to say even like a woman in Saudi who is wearing the long black dress with the black scarf, that's not particularly traditional either, especially when you get some of the bedazzle that happens. Do we have traditions where people would draw something over them to wear when they were transiting between houses? Definitely. But working in the hospital setting, people will come up to me frequently and see, there's a very traditionally dressed person. I think she might like a visit from you. And I go in and she's, wearing Turkish attire that was definitely purchased last month during her trip to Turkey that looks nothing like traditional Turkish attire. So, yeah.
What about conflating abhorrent cultural practices such as female genital mutilation with Islam?
Yeah, that's a great one. And Islam specifically, without recognizing it's practiced by Christians in the same area, which is another one with underage marriage, where we see it happens with Hindu women in India, with Catholic girls in Latin America, but we don't make the same assumption, right? So they're seen as individual cases as opposed to representative of the faith at large. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I know. It's so exciting, though. Particularly, it's a really American thing. Because when Americans think of modesty, what do we think of? We think of the Amish, and we think of Puritans, right? And I mean, we're probably not aware that that's what we're thinking of, but those are two trains of faith that have really defined how we think about modesty in this country. A very different way of thinking about modesty is to cover the curves of one's body. There's a part of the Quran where clothing is to be an adornment. The best of us are those who dress like the prophets, but there's also an adornment component of things that's it's a very different way of thinking about modesty. Yeah. Yeah, Lena.
There's often an assumption that if a woman is educated or outspoken, that she's moved away from religious practice,
Mm-hmm.
from outside influence, and so she has to push aside religion or escape it,
Yeah.
as opposed to it being seen as part and parcel of the religion.
Huge. Mm-hmm. This idea that she is exceptional, somehow outside of the norm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I want to just draw out a couple of others, and I think we'd get there if we went just a little bit longer. But one of the ideas is that Islam and Muslims are monolithic. We are all the same, regardless of the time period or the culture of origin or our presence anywhere. We're just sort of monolithically interchangeable. Aladdin is a great example of this. So there are many different cultures that are all woven into one culture in Aladdin, the old one and the new one, right? Arabs are actually not the same as Indians, but they're presented as being this sort of, what's the city in Aladdin? Abu Ghraib, thank you. Which apparently a lot of Muslims think it would be okay to bomb. There was if you haven't seen it, there was a survey that was done on it, and that was one of the questions is like, do you think it would be acceptable to bomb Abu Ghraib and Agrabah, excuse me. And people overwhelmingly said yes, right? It doesn't exist. But that idea that of sort of monolithic, everything goes together does. Another one is that any Muslim at any point could become radicalized, almost like it's a sickness that people could catch. And so even if a Muslim seems really good, they could become a terrorist at any moment. Or, worse yet, or better yet, depending on how you're thinking about stereotypes, that they might be hiding, they might be lying, because Muslims have an allowance to lie about their faith. So they might be presenting themselves as nice people, but we can't actually believe anything they say because they have a religious allowance to lie about it. Other ones I want to make sure we hit on. Yeah, just the oppressed Muslim woman is one we're going to talk more about and the ways that manifests. The other one is this idea that the religion of Islam came a lot later than the religion of Christianity. And so really we just need to give Muslims more time to catch up. They'll get there, but they got a late start, essentially. There's a beautiful chart that should be in your resources from the Knowledge is Beautiful website that shows you all of the science and philosophy and other ideas that developed much earlier in Muslim lands and then trickled through into European Christian lands. Later in time, and I would encourage you to see it. The one other thing I put out that is sort of part of how we think about Islam or Muslims and Christians today is when we think about the Crusades as a war between Christians and Muslims. Many of you who are history teachers know that the actual picture is a lot more complicated than that. We had alliances on both sides with people of different faiths. It had a lot to do with land and power and struggle. And that's, I guess, that which speaks to a larger trope of Islamophobia is that anytime there's a conflict between Muslims, it must somehow relate to the religion itself. So we think of conflict between Sunni and Shia as simply a theological thing they can't get past, as opposed to a complex history between power and land and resources. Okay. Keep track of the time here. So when we talk about Muslim women, this is kind of where I want to hone in on in terms of how we think about Islamophobia. And you have in your teaching packet, you've got a whole bunch more resources. There is a tremendous amount of scholarship that started coming out of this in the past decade, but particularly since 2015, when the presidential election process sort of began ramping up. And a lot of the information that I have here, I think in some ways has really shifted when we talk about sort of the lived impact. But this idea of needing to save Muslim women from Muslim men, which is very prevalent even today, is really one of the greatest tools of colonization. In third world feminists or women among third world womanist movements, they talk about this idea of saving brown women from brown men as a tool of colonization. We also, sort of a subset of that is this idea that we need to liberate Muslim women. So I want to share one example of that. Lord Cromer was the British sort of governor of Egypt, or he may not have been the governor. He played a sort of critical role in colonization in the late 1800s. And at the time, women in England were fighting for the rights to vote, among other things, or vote. I'm sorry, I should have reviewed this again. This teething kid is doing me in. But they were working for increasing women's rights in Britain. And one of the things he said was, feminism on the home front and feminism directed against white men was to be resisted and suppressed. But if it were taken abroad and directed against the cultures of colonized peoples, it could be used for the further dominance of the white man. Some of these things that happened, I think, happened accidentally because people weren't as aware. But some of them were very intentional. One of the things that he did was to close the Egyptian women's medical school and clinics, saying that men should be doctors because it was more becoming of women to have the opportunity to stay at home. Women's head coverings have been a very integral part of this move to liberate Muslim women all over the world, and we've seen it play out in a lot of different ways. We saw, for example, in Iran, when the Shah came and said, we're taking them off. You're no longer allowed to wear them. It was this idea that they were going to liberate Muslim women from the oppression of the hijab. A wonderful Iranian friend of mine talks about how her grandmother just absolutely freaked out because there's a tradition, or there was a particularly prevalent tradition, of the women going to the baths every day. And she said, I can't go out naked, right? Like, if you've always covered your hair, to walk out without it covered, you feel naked. She said, I can't be seen outside of the house, just like I can't go out in my underwear. And so she asked to be put in a potato sack and carried in a wagon to hide to get to the baths. They're also created these entire networks of women climbing over fences because commonly like houses have gardens. So they create these networks where the women could transit through still covered so that they wouldn't have this feeling of nakedness. One person's idea of liberation and another person's may be very different. We see where the flip side of that came around then, where the hijab was claimed as part of the Iranian Revolution, and a large part of it around Iranian identity being a big fact as a sort of vis-a-vis Western culture. We see it now, as we were talking earlier about in France. And just to emphasize sort of how prevalent this is still in the modern discourse, a lot of women who were involved with the anti-war movement, particularly earlier with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, would say things like, well, at least good things will come out of this for the women. And it sort of became almost a justification for these otherwise unjust wars, or it was an upshot of an otherwise unfortunate situation. And that comes very specifically from Laura Bush's 2003 speech, that the wars were not in big public favor. And she came out and she reframed these wars, which had not much to do about women's liberations, as wars for women's liberation. And it created an acceptable place in the American imagination for them. This statistic is from pre-2015. More than 80% of media images of Muslim women are negative or passive. And this is one example. So this picture here is from the BBC. They were trying to explain the differences in styles of hair coverings worn by Muslim women. See, these women don't really look like people I want to be friends with. Right? Like, this is just a basic example of the way in which this image, like, yeah, they do. Well, maybe a little bit on the right, she looks a little different, but they don't really look like the lived reality of many women wearing headscarves, right? So imagine if these were the media images that you saw. And I think what's exciting is that increasingly these are the media images that we see because the media has realized that they have a responsibility to do a better job representing and that they actually have an incredible impact on the world. It's also why I was able to get a shirt like this from Target, right? This is a traditional Islamic tile pattern, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, printed onto a shirt. Almost any poster or advertisement that you see now, there'll be the intentional inclusion of the hijabi Muslim woman. I think only 40-something% of the American Muslim community, the women wear hijab. Somebody correct me if that statistic is wrong that knows. There are a lot of Muslim women who don't wear hijab. It becomes an easy visual depiction of giving voice to Muslims. It's a struggle. Is it fair? Is it not fair? Kind of how does it work? It's an easy way for companies to say that we affirm the presence of Muslims, and so it sort of becomes in that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Islamophobia in the media, and again, this is shifting in ways that I think are really positive and could be really exciting to explore with your students. But between 2001 and 2011, a groundbreaking study was done looking at all of the different stories that were published about Islam or about Muslims. And what they saw in 2001 was that, sorry, it should be an arrow up here, 2% of the stories in the overall media, so out of all of the stories that were printed between the major news sources they were looking at, 2% of them were stories about Muslim terrorists or extremists. And only 0.1% were stories about ordinary Muslims. So we saw between 2001 and 2011, we have this huge increase in stories that are negatively portraying, or that are, I don't know the negatively portraying, but let's say stories about the bad guys, right, who are not actually representative of the vast majority of us. So there's a huge increase there, but the number about ordinary Muslims stays exactly the same. One of the tropes that comes out of this is this idea that, well, not all Muslims are terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslim, right? Which we know, and increasingly, unfortunately, we know is not the case. And this statistic is really, it's heartbreaking because 38% of Americans believe that crimes committed by Muslims represent Islam itself. So if a Muslim does anything, it's representative of the faith. However, 75% believe that crimes committed by Christians don't reflect Christianity. How many news stories have you caught where the crime is nothing about terrorism and it still talks about the person's identity as a Muslim? Yet we don't typically get to learn if somebody who is robbing a bank or otherwise involved in a traffic incident's faith. And the other reason why this is really big, can you see the terrorists up there? No, probably not very well. That's because there are a very small number of Muslims. So this is, I think, also from the Knowledge is Beautiful. They did a track, so 0.009% of Muslims are identified with a violent jihadi group, if you will. I like to call them the bad guys, because there's a variety of different reasons why people become involved with those. Then the US State Department estimates that it's about 150,000, and that's from 2015. One of the other tropes is that all Muslim terrorist groups are fighting for the same thing. There's a huge difference, and while they're increasingly in global contact and dialogue, many of them are fighting for very specific regional reasons.
Is it okay to say extremist and terrorist? It's the same. I said Muslim extremist or Muslim terrorist. I'm just wondering, I hear those terms.
Yeah. That's a good question. I don't know, thoughts from other Muslims in the room. The terms, they're so elusive, you know? Somebody who's, it's what does it say? One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Boko Haram, here's a great example for those of you who are teachers in the room. It always gets translated as no Western education, but it's usually translated without the context of the way in which the sort of pseudo-colonizing Christian education has taught a gospel of wealth and of exclusion, which I don't think is representative of Christianity. Unfortunately, it may be their only interaction with it. When they talk about being against Western education, they're not necessarily against learning math and science. They're against a political system implemented through an education framework. So some of them would be terrorists, those who are actually participating in terror attacks, but the others maybe would be extremists. I have a Nigerian friend who's a priest, and sitting next to him when the news coverage comes on about things in Nigeria just drives him nuts because there's so little of the story that's actually covered. Indonesia, it's just the same thing. I lived in Indonesia for a semester. The Indonesian stories that you guys get in the media here are so disproportionately representative of a very small segment of Indonesian population. But they're the only things you hear, so you think that they're representative of the country at large. It's heartbreaking. Yeah, Lena. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Try to reference it to say Taliban, Al-Qaeda, oh wow, or ISIS or whatever.
Right. Choose their specific allegiance. Yeah.
If possible, but I think it gets to the point of Islamophobia that sometimes we don't even know who we're talking about, right. So we just use these blanket statements because, we don't really, the country doesn't know who it's at war with, and it's really complicated kind of situation.
Yeah. And Islamic terrorism suggests that there's something in Islam that is inspiring their actions, which the vast majority of Muslims would say their behavior is totally un-Islamic. Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about the manifestation of Islamophobia in America. Some of the things we've talked about are sort of incidental to the way history and politics roll out, but increasingly what we're seeing is really very intentional things. These link back to the experiences of Catholics here. Those of you who are teaching about the Holocaust will also find similar rhetoric in the buildup of things. There's a very intentional effort that's been tracked by publicly available tax returns. The Center for American Progress, the Council for American Islamic Relations, and the Southern Poverty Law Center all have information, and you can see the site. There's a site down here at the bottom where you can go to learn more. But through publicly available tax documents, they were able to track that we were talking about 115 or more million of revenue between 2008 and 2011. This works through a group of foundations who then funnel money to institutions and to individuals. I apologize, those should be arrows on here. There are a lot of people making a lot of money off of this, and they're what we call the misinformant network. So they are presented as being subject matter experts. A great one that you can look at is Walid Shabat, who sort of has presented himself as this expert. Anderson Cooper does a thing about how they used to use him as a expert on the coverage, and they then started looking into things and found that the charity that he claimed to exist didn't exist, and the story that he claimed to have also didn't exist. He claimed that he had tried to bomb a bank, which there was no record of the bombing, and that he had been a prisoner, and there was also no record of that as well. And yet he's taught classes for like the Ohio Citizens Response Teams and paid by the government. Ayan Hirsi Ali is another one who I'll skip over because I want to get through all of this. They've taught this misinformant network has taught classes at the FBI, the CIA, West Point, and the New York City Police Department. Some of the things that they have taught would be indicators for who a likely terrorist might be. Would be anyone wearing traditional, my favorite word, Islamic clothing, AKA me, growing a beard. I'm working on it. It's not coming very quick, but my husband has a nice one. Abstaining from alcohol, yep, the vast majority of Muslims I know, and becoming involved with social activism. Dude, anybody who has taught about McCarthyism or learned about it, that should be a red flag. So if those are who your likely potential terrorists is, that means all of the Muslim peace activists that I know who are working for human rights and dignity in the world are potentially likely terrorists. When you take a lens like that and use it to teach the people who are in charge of security for this country and the world, it creates a real conflict. As Robert McFadden, the retired Navy Criminal Investigative Service, said, teaching counterterrorism operatives about obscure aspects of Islam without context, without objectivity, and without covering other non-religious drivers of dangerous behavior is no way to stop actual terrorists. One quick case study, the New York City Police Department had a 13-year program to identify terrorists in the New York City area. Because of the separation of church and state, they can't specifically follow Muslims, so they looked at ethnic communities of concern instead. So Arab, African American, Indian American, et cetera. They had license plate monitors outside of mosques capturing who went in. They were tracking who was donating through charities, which were actually not just charities for Muslims, but also serving hungry New Yorkers at large. They had undercover operatives operating in most of the populated mosque areas, and were following also ethnic grocery stores and restaurants, so everybody's comfort food. The result when this came public, the AP brought it public, was that Muslims were scared to go to the mosque. They were scared to go to the grocery store and get their favorite foods. They no longer wanted to give to charities because they realized that the government was tracking this and that the government didn't actually have a framework for understanding who would come out of this. It had a tremendous impact on the Muslim community. The court ruled that it was not actually NYPD's fault, but it was the AP's fault for bringing it public, and that's where the damage on the Muslim community had come from. So some really interesting things for those of you who are teaching about history to dive into with that case. And it's in the appeal process, and I'm not sure where it is right now. But the biggest takeaway from that, they never caught a single terrorist. The impact on the community was so profound, and yet they never caught a single terrorist. They also traveled out of their jurisdiction, so they followed a Muslim spring break group into upstate New York. That's my homeland. Don't mess with us. The person reported that the Muslims weren't very observant because they only prayed 3 times a day, and they're Sunni, so theoretically they should have been praying 5 times. Except when Muslims are traveling, we combine our prayers into 2 sets, and he just apparently slept through the morning prayer. Right? So when these are the people you have reporting on us, you got a problem. They were also over into New Jersey as well. So it'll be interesting to see where that case ultimately goes. Supporting your Muslim students. Okay, where are we at here? I was told I could go a little bit over, but I don't want to take it too far here. So what I want to give you here is some information to be aware of, but do not assume anything. Every Muslim is different in their approach to practice. Every Muslim community is different in their approach to practice. So don't assume anything, but here are some things you could be aware of. If you have the option of adding a Muslim prayer, reflection, or sorry, not a Muslim one, but just a general meditation, prayer, reflection, quiet space, etc., into your school or into your classroom, it provides places for students to pray. Most of our prayers, most of the year can be made at home, but there are smaller windows in the winter because we follow we follow the sun's path and when we pray. Considerations, it would want to be in the northeast corner of the room because we pray towards Mecca the way the crow flies. So that's actually northeast in all of America. Having a little bit of the area screened off to give a little bit of privacy can be appreciated. Some Muslims can pray really quick. They can do it in 5 minutes. Your longest ones could take about 15 minutes, and that includes with the washing process that happens beforehand. And because we wash our feet, it's helpful if you have the option of a mat that goes under the sink to catch that water so that it doesn't get things dirty. Ramadan, we follow a lunar calendar as our overall calendar, but we don't have the handy little reset that Jewish people have. And so our calendar is moving 10 to 11 days earlier every year. So Ramadan has just concluded, and it's hard to keep up with as a result, but it does mean that it will be increasingly in the school year. One thing to think about, if you see your students starting to fall asleep, great opportunity for a stretch break. Everybody, just stand up, take a big breath. It's probably what we ought to do now. Students may benefit from having an alternative space to go during the lunch period, so offering a space like a pass to go to the library. Also, you want to think about sports practices here is the other thing and how that will impact students. There's a wonderful movie, Fortson, Faith, Football, and Fasting, about how the Fortson High School, which I think is 98% Muslim, if I'm not mistaken, chose to navigate football practices. They're also a really big football team during Ramadan. And then being aware, Eid comes, we have 2 Eids. One is at the conclusion of Ramadan, and then the other follows a couple of months later. Different communities go by different ways. So some of us still remain reliant on God and wait for the moon sighting. The others follow a calculation. So Canton, for example, their mosque follows a calculation. Ann Arbor's mosque waits for the moon sighting, which means we're sometimes celebrating the start of Ramadan and the conclusion with Eid on different days. So there's not really a good way to follow that except if you go to the mosque website and look. But not all of the students here are going to be following a mosque because they may be connected with the Shia community over in Dearborn and doing it a different way there. I'm sorry, it's tricky, but it's a good lesson in patience. Checking in with students, particularly when there has been a terrorist attack. So, for example, like the events in New Zealand felt very, very close to home for American Muslims because it was specifically really an attack in another Western context. Just asking students how they're doing, if there's anything that they need, and being conscious that a student may share challenges that they're having with you, but not necessarily want you to do anything about it. So checking in with a student, would you like me to follow up with the administration? Would you like me to speak to this person? So that you're both giving them a space to share, but then following their lead on how they would like you to navigate that. Physical education, students, both men and women, may specifically require or prefer to have a private space to shower. So for both men and women, there's a part of our bodies which should not be shared in public, even within the same gender context. It's common that many Muslims will choose to shower at home and will change in the bathroom stalls within a gym setting. Co-ed gym classes after puberty can be challenging. In some Muslim communities, we're talking over here about one of the schools that has about a 25% Yemeni Muslim population. When teachers assign boys and girls to work together in groups, it can be a problem. Dances, for a multitude of reasons. Health education can be another one. Parents will oftentimes prefer that their children not be in health education. Thinking about how you can support parents in educating their children themselves can be helpful for that. And I'm sorry, that word is spelled wrong, but also in thinking about chaperones for traveling groups, with gender with that. Dietary, we joke that we're halal, or we're kosher light, so food doesn't need to be made through the same intensity that the kosher rules are, the kashrut rules, but we also don't eat pork, and that includes gelatin if it's from pork. Alcohol, and not just drunk, but for some more conservative practicing Muslims, they also don't like vanilla cookies would be problematic, or Dijon mustard. That's kind of on the way more rigid end of things. For a lot of American Muslims, just not eating pork is fine. So they may eat any form of chicken, and it's really a variety of personal by personal practice. Meat ideally would be zabiha, which is in terms of how it's been slaughtered, which is very similar to the kosher regulations. But again, none of this is stuff that you should assume. You should but have an awareness to ask your student how they may need to be accommodated or supported. All right. So I promised that I would cover this. American Islam versus Islam, or Indonesian Islam versus Islam. There is a tendency, and I think we're growing up out of this in America, to see our form of Islam as the authentic one, because it's free from cultural influence, because we have Muslims who come here from all over the world, or we have African American Muslims who came outside of the sort of Arab corrupted sense of what it meant to be Muslim, who have accessed the pure form of Islam. And what we're realizing is that American culture influences our practice of Islam just as much as Arab culture or Indonesian culture, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we've kind of graduated past that as a community, but it's a constant question that I think Muslims all over the world have, is what is the relationship between culture and religion? One of the interesting ways that comes up for Muslims is that as Islam spread, the Sharia allowed for the existence of traditional practice from a community if it wasn't seen as being in conflict with the Sharia itself. In older scholarship, that was what allowed for what we would call female genital mutilation, or others might call circumcision, because it was an early practice that predated Islam and predated Christianity in the region, and was sort of subsumed into things as the religion spread to the area. What we see now in both faiths is strong teaching, both locally and nationally, against it as a form of practice, but it is something that continues to be a struggle. So there continues, I think, to be this negotiation between culture and religion. I'm gonna wrap up there.